Welcome to the workshop. Hi, today we're making a lap joint and we're going to make what is known as a 90-degree T lap. So these two pieces of wood are going to be joined together such that the finished article looks like this, a letter T, or perhaps you see a T that way up. We're just doing it at the end of a piece of waste here. They'll finish up flush on this side and on the back side, and this end will be flush with this long edge. Now you'll probably see later on that it's quite possible to cut this joint right up to the end of this section, and in that case we end up with an L-shaped joint like so, and we can put it anywhere along here, and we can even cut it so that this piece crosses over, in which case we get a cross lap joint. You can do it at an angle. Just be careful with the marking out. But for this demonstration I'm going to be doing a T-shaped joint like so. So let's get started. To begin with, let me just point out that these pieces of wood have been prepared the same thickness. They are also the same width, but that's not important in this joint. The lap is in the thickness of the material, and I call it a half lap joint. That's its name because we take half of the material away from this piece and half away from this piece. When we put those two halves together we get one whole, and that's why the whole thing lines up flush on both sides. So first of all we'll mark a knife line at 90 degrees to our first piece. And then we'll mark the width of this material, and I'm going to do that by putting it on top against the square, holding it still and marking a second knife line. Ordinarily you would measure out and use the square. Now I need to transfer those marking lines halfway down the depth of this piece. Registering the knife in the previous knife line, moving the square up, knifing it, and then you need to knife halfway down the other side. Register in the previous knife line, move the square up, halfway down, and final one there. And on our other piece of wood, we want this to end up flush. I'm going to leave it just slightly longer so that we can flush that up with a plane. I'm going to take my square on here, use the thickness of this board to set the position of my square, just so that we're slightly long. Lock the square in position, mark a knife line, and then mark that halfway down each side. remembering always to register the stock of your square on either the face side or face edge of your work. Okay, and next is to mark out the halfway point through the material, and we'll use a marking gauge to do that. I'm going to use this wheel marking gauge, and to set it, just initially guess roughly halfway, lock it, make a little mark, turn the material the other way round, make another little mark. Now we need to set our gauge halfway between those two, so move it over a little bit, eyeball that, make a mark, flip it over, another mark, and they're nicely lined up. You may need to do that a few times until you get exactly the right position. So now I'll mark that line through halfway down that section, flip it over, staying on the face side, mark halfway again, let's mark the middle of this section, between our knife lines, flip that round, do the other side, to make sawing a little bit easier, I'm going to pare out a little bit of wood against our knife line, so we have a little shoulder against which to put our saw blade. So just be careful, just meet your line and remove that little piece of wood. Now we have a nice channel there to put our saw into to start our cut. I'll do the same on the other side and on the other piece of wood, and then we can saw it. Now, using my Japanese planing board, a Japanese saw on the saw stop, rest it in the little groove we made, and just saw down to the halfway point. It's the first piece, and the second piece, and then what we need to do is remove the waste from both pieces of wood. Now, I've clamped my work in the bench here, but you could equally well clamp it to the top of the bench, preferably against a dog or another piece of wood clamped against the back of it, just to give it some extra support. And I'm going to remove the waste material by taking slanting cuts upwards from the edge towards the middle, And before you get to the knife line, switch over and work from the other side. As you approach the knife line, switch over to pairing cuts and just take a thin piece at a time. Try not to work right across to prevent you tearing out any material on the other side. And the grain on this piece of wood is really quite wild, and you can see I've done it right next to a knot, so I'm really doing it in quite a difficult piece of timber here. You might like to try on something a lot easier to work with for your first go, but this just shows that it's possible. Just take your time. So switching back to the other side now. Approach that knife line. Try and read the direction of the grain if you're having problems with it, and treat it the same as if you were planing. So move from side to side with the chisel to prevent tear out. And as you come down towards your knife line, just take smaller and smaller bites, because you want, if you can, to end up with as smoother joint surface as possible. Eventually you'll be able to feed your chisel blade right into your knife line, and take the final shavings across the joint surface. And I've come in on the knife line now, and I'm referencing the flat of my chisel against the vice cheek, which is slightly lower than a knife line, so I know that I'm going to end up with a pyramid, as it were, in the middle, which I can then flatten down across the width of the joint. And I'm slightly short on my sawing there. So I can just take a little bit more out. And that's nearly done. And what we should find, because of the way we've cut within our knife line slightly, we should find that this is very tight fit, won't quite want to go in, which is great, because then we'll finish up by doing vertical cuts with our chisel, working right from the knife line perpendicularly down, but we'll do that on top of the bench. Let's cut the other half off the the second piece, we can take most of this off with a saw. So we can cut down our centre line. And then the same procedure as with the other one, just paring right down to the knife line. Now I've clamped my work down on the bench. I'm going to cut the shoulders here at 90 degrees using a sharp chisel, working from my knife line . And just clean the corner out. Same with the other side. I'll set my square up on the bench and then eyeball it using the square as a reference. And that's a lovely tight fit. I just want to clean the shoulder up on this piece as well. And that's going together lovely and tight, I think you can see, and flush. Tight and flush, that's what we're after. I'll glue that and then we'll just clean off, flush off this side with a plane. Maybe give one pass over there. I can feel a very slight difference there. So smoothing plane over here, flush that off with a block plane and a smoothing plane, and that's it done. So I've had a cup of tea and swept up a bit, so I think this must be dry by now. And I'm just going to flush that off with a smoother. Should stop it moving too much. That's lovely and flush. That's super. And then we need to flush up where we left this joint section a little bit long. Just using a block plane. And the smoother. And there we have a 90-degree lapped T-joint, perfect 90 degrees, perfectly flush, tight joints all around. That's what you're aiming for. And as I said before, we could have made this right on the corner, in which case it would have been a lapped L joint. It is really a T. It looks like a T at the moment. We could have had excess on the end of here, so it would have been a cross joint. All following the same principle. Half the material removed from one piece, half from the other, so everything ends up lovely and flush. Why not give it a go?